So did you want to start or did you want me to start?
You can start.
Okay. Yeah, so we're live now, and this video recording will be on our YouTube channel. And I guess just a little bit about me and like how I even started talking about safer spaces. Just being in the community for quite some time, kind of witnessing harm that was being caused, and even myself, like not having places that I really felt comfortable in or safe in. And so I think that's really why we even started A7G. We started A7G about over, it's been a while now, like over 5 years ago, almost 7 years, I think. And we just really wanted to work on building healthier community and safer community. And so of course, like along the way, we ran into our struggles and our bumps, but I think that's what you have to do. And so when you are trying to create safer spaces, you're trying to create as little harm as possible. Like literally, that's the intention, and that's the goal, is to even have no harm caused if possible. And but it might happen. You might do something that you're not even aware of. You might have to spend time learning about things yourself, and all you got to do is just apologize, acknowledge that you made a mistake, and keep going. And so like myself too, I've done that. I've had to apologize and do better. So in order to create safer spaces, like it's really about putting your pride aside, putting your ego aside, and just being the best you can be. So I'm going to share a little, one of the ways we kind of like started like guidelines or safety protocols for our drop-ins. So we have drop-ins every Friday night, and we've been doing them now for about 2.5 years. We've never missed a Friday, but one of the first things we felt like we had to do before we just keep gathering is we kind of had to all agree on what our group norms were, and really kind of get to the same understanding on certain things. So we created our group norms, probably like one of the first things we ever did. And we literally just had like a flip chart and a marker, and we had an open circle, open like dialogue about what is safety for us. And so a lot of things came out of that conversation, and we kind of look at this as like a living document. So maybe even like soon, maybe even this year, I think we'll have to update it, and just go back and reflect, like, did we cover everything? Is there other group norms that we should add to this? And of course, like one of the first ones that came up is respect. So respect yourselves, respect each other's stories and differences. And so respect protocols, ceremonies, and sacred items. Just like if there's sacred items that are in the area, like please don't touch them. Like only touch things if you're given permission. And of course that also applies to our bodies, and our hair, our just all of our belongings. Like that's one of the like a really basic group norm is just don't touch things that don't belong to you unless you're given permission. So consent is really, really important when it comes to safety. And taking care of our space was a really big one too, because we operate as a really grassroots youth group. We don't have like, there's not like a cleaning person that comes by at the end of our group and cleans up everything for us. Like we got to do that ourselves. And so we really have to respect each other and all put in the work to clean up our space. And sometimes we also do activities that are outside, and so that same rule applies to respecting the land that we're using. And a really big philosophy that many of us carry is, we leave the earth, the land, the way we found it, if not better. So we never leave a place like with garbage everywhere, or with a lot of damage or anything like that. So yeah, that's respect for us. And you know, it's really important to also understand that like group norms isn't like a set of guidelines that I created for the group. So these group norms are created from by all of us, and we came to a consensus about these group norms. And so that's really, really important. I find like a lot of times there's like youth programming, and like there's like a youth program officer or coordinator or something, and they end up creating the protocols or the rules for the group, but that takes away the autonomy of the group. And it's really important that Indigenous youth especially feel like they have the control over what is acceptable and what's not acceptable. So that kind of leads into like speaking up. Sometimes, someone's going to make a mistake. Sometimes, like what's a really important one that maybe like a lot of non-Indigenous folks don't think about is stepping over someone's shadow. That can be really disrespectful to someone. And so, I've seen that before. And that's just an example is maybe someone stepped over someone's shadow, and that's really important to that person's culture and knowledge and understanding of life. And so instead of like actually saying to that person, like, hey, like you stepped over my shadow, they got really upset and didn't talk about it. And so that understanding was lost, and even that potential for better relationships was ended. And so that's something that's really important to us is, if someone in our group, and keep in mind we're all Indigenous folks in our youth group, if someone does something that makes you feel uncomfortable, like please say something. And if you don't feel comfortable saying something to that person directly, like just let maybe your friend know, let someone who could maybe say something to that person know. So yeah, that's something that's really, really important to us. It's also really important to us because we always do a sharing circle. Sharing circle is one of the ways we do peer-to-peer support. And so in that sharing circle, if you don't feel like you're in a space where you can be honest and truthful and vocal, you're going to end up bottling up a lot of things. And that's not the type of space we want to create. We want to create a space that folks can express themselves in a good way and a truthful way and a real way. And that means, there's a lot of laughter and a lot of great things that happen, but that also means that we're there for each other when it's a bad time, or we're having a hard time. And so that goes into the next one, which is be selfless, not selfish. And so, being really aware of your surroundings. For example, when we have food, making sure that everyone gets food before just taking like 10 slices of pizza. That's being selfless. That's thinking about your peers and the group. And so like I've been to not tons, but I've been to several like non-Indigenous events, like mainly operated by white folks, where the food comes out and then it's like a free for all. And for us, like that's really not acceptable because, it's the worst feeling when you're hungry, you're trying to get some food, and then everyone ate all the food already. That's not a good feeling at all. And that also goes against a lot of our traditions. Um, so that's so important, building community. Building community also for us means having hard conversations and working through things. It's like a family. It's not just like a community hobby or something you do sometimes, but it's really a family. And so it's your chosen family, but there's still going to be things that you have to spend time working through. And so, really avoiding spreading rumors and gossip is really important. And But also sometimes, yeah, sometimes gossip can also mean other things. And so we can talk about that after. But yeah, basically keep the BS at the door. Like if you're in the space, you're there to hang out with folks, see folks, just check in and kind of live in the moment for a little bit. And so something that's also really important is listening. I feel like that's kind of like a given, but it's something that we still have to practice often and consistently. It's like the one analogy I can think of is kind of like crossing the street. So even like when you're raising kids or when you're around children, even though you've probably told them look both ways before you cross the street, you still tell them again and again. And so it's okay to have reminders and keep learning things again. So listening, pretty given, but I just wanted to mention that circle protocol, what stays in the circle or what's said in the circle stays in the circle. So again, like going into gossip, like if someone's sharing a really personal information, it's really important that you don't even talk about that situation after the circle or with people that weren't even in the circle. And so that's just, being respectful of that person's story. Um, we have had instances where, you know, really, really, we've had really intense circles. And so in some of those circles, something like suicide could come up. And so in those instances, it's really, really important to know what the line is. It's really important for people in the circle and facilitating the circle to know when to ask for help from outside the circle. But it's still important to ask that person that may have shared some really intense subjects or feelings. It's really important to ask them if it's okay for you as a circle facilitator or program coordinator or event coordinator, if you can get help, if you can find more resources for them. There always has to be consent involved and permission. um, and so lastly, have fun, have fun in these spaces, laugh. For almost every Indigenous person I know, laughter is just like the backbone of who we are. And so it's really important that when we're in spaces, we can be loud and laugh loud. And if you've ever heard Native women laughing, it's like it'll like shake your whole house. And so, like really having spaces that are okay with that, having spaces that won't silence that laughter or that loudness is really important. um, and so yeah, those are kind of our group norms, and they're created by Indigenous youth for Indigenous youth. And whenever someone new joins the circle, we often ask them to go over the group norms, and it's really like a living document for us. So I have some more stuff to share after, but I'll hand it off to you, RJ, if you wanted to share more on that, or if that led into any other thoughts.
Yeah, definitely. I find a lot of the reasons why I got into talking about like safer spaces and safer communities really goes back to like a lot about how like I've been able to contextualize my own identity. So I mentioned earlier I'm a two-spirit person, I'm a transgender person, and for a long time I didn't necessarily understand like what that meant for me. But I found like one of the big things that I learned was when I started to actually work in non-Indigenous spaces, I felt I got access to a certain type of language that I feel I didn't have access to when I was working and like existing mostly in Indigenous spaces. And I think that's been super crucial to a lot of my learning because it allowed me access and space into a completely different area where the conversations of consent happen a lot earlier on, like the conversations of healthy relationships and like checking in with people and seeing how those folks are doing. Um, it was just completely different. One of the things I did note though in my time of like working primarily and only in Indigenous spaces and kind of switching over to LGBTQ spaces, it was super white. And I found there was like little space for me to like be a like Indigenous person. Um, I find like from being a transgender Indigenous human, like I have become really critical about what safety means for me, and the ways in which that has been restricted being in the like an Indigenous community. I found like people that I trusted and cared about within community, like Indigenous community spaces, I felt like didn't create space for me in the same way because I find like almost like talking about like gender and how gender is so like very much prescribed and how I was never really comfortable with that and didn't actually have tools or language to access what that meant to me. I found when I started to understand that and kind of shift my identity and how I existed in Indigenous spaces, it made a lot of other folks uncomfortable. And I found like I wasn't invited into spaces as much. People didn't want to bring me into those spaces, mostly because um, I was too, I guess, like political when I was talking about like gender and sexuality, or I was talking about violence, or I was talking about like consent. And it's interesting how the forms of like quote unquote not healthy communication, but the communication that we kind of want to strive for, that goes beyond like I guess the intergenerational stuff that a lot of us deal with. um, it's just something that I find that was a skill that I needed to acquire that I couldn't have acquired if I wasn't queer or if I wasn't trans. And it made me very critical when I started to reintegrate and go back into like Indigenous spaces. I find it reshifted my entire, when I say like my entire, it literally reshifted the ways that I like exist and think and exist in the world. It's so different from how I was a couple of years ago. And really, it was just having access and understanding that like the world can be really different than what I had initially prescribed. Um, I'm I always say like I am a two-spirit person, I'm transgender, I am a queer person, but also like there have been a lot of times within my life where I have also been homophobic and I've also been transphobic, and really like coming to terms with that and understanding that meant like diving deeper, similarly to like what Gabby was saying about like being understanding that we're going to make mistakes and also like being okay with that. I find that like accessing a whole other community required me going into spaces where it wasn't just Indigenous folks, it was people from all sorts of different backgrounds. And it made me have to like analyze, like, wow, like I didn't realize that growing up in Indigenous spaces that we're actually kind of xenophobic and we're really racist to immigrants and we're really anti-Black and we're really like Islamophobic. And these are all things I started to learn mostly because I was in spaces that let me have access to people that had typically like something that is almost like looked down on. I find like growing up in even in an urban Indigenous context, there was always this narrative around like, we're working with our community, we do everything for our community, we don't need anything outside of that. And I think that was super harmful, and I can really contextualize why that was. And a lot of that, like, I understand is for safety, but it also allowed us to like manifest those like biases that are actually really harmful to others. And I think too, like when I think about the ways in which like I have like manifested xenophobia in my life, and projected that onto others, like thinking about that is really hard, and the ways in which I have caused harm to other people. But I think in order to talk about like safety, we have to be willing to be critical about ourselves first. Wouldn't be able to do the kind of work that I do today if I was not willing to admit that I can also be wrong. And I think like it's really hard to be wrong because it puts us in a inherent and vulnerable situation. And a lot of the times, like intergenerational trauma means that we can't have these difficult conversations with ourselves because we internalize them and think that that means we're just bad people. But that's actually like not the case. And I find like it's been a true gift to work in a lot of different communities and learn that actually communication is very much cultural, but it is definitely come at the cost of like being able to access certain spaces. Like for the most part, now that I started like transitioning, like I can represent myself in different communities in certain ways where I can get away with looking like a boy. But that doesn't mean like that someone who I don't necessarily like, someone who doesn't really like understand the gender stuff and might be like a native person, will like not misgender me in those spaces, and that can kind of like cause harm. And I think like those instances of transphobia and just like really recognizing different parts of my identity, and like how there are times like I am put at risk in different spaces, always brings me back to like the thought of safety. I always think like, what are things that I can do now, acknowledging that like, yes, there are times I've made a lot of mistakes and I will continue to make a lot of mistakes. And I think about these things continuously. But how do I do the least amount of harm? And I think that has like allowed me to kind of like shift and like start to work in an area, in a field where like, yeah, I am technically like an anti-O educator, except I would say and argue that I actually think anti-oppression and anti-racist education kind of fails us, because we need to talk about why biases exist. And like, why do like a lot of Indigenous folks that I grew up with, like, why are they okay with xenophobia? And then it really makes me think about how like, yeah, actually I understand like there's a fear of recolonization. And if I meet people where they're at and understand that like, yeah, this person is afraid of like being recolonized, then it gives me an understanding of like how to engage in a conversation to kind of shift out of that narrative. I think too, like generally, like the word community is really interesting to me, because I think a lot of the times, like people don't realize community goes beyond just having potlucks together and cultural gatherings. It goes beyond having dinners and like the brunches that we all kind of like crave around the social aspect of it, because it actually requires us to like think about the importance of how do we hold people that we love accountable when they've done really shitty things to a partner. Like I think a lot of the times, like a lot of people struggle with that thought. A lot of people don't know how to hold a loved one accountable when they've hurt another person, because that requires one, a lot of like emotional capacity to have that conversation, but also like being okay with however that person's response is. And I find like, again, like I can't stress how incredibly important it was to like work in LGBTQ spaces, a lot of like sexual health and like white feminist spaces and indigenous spaces. All of these different communities led me to even more diverse communities than I was like used to ever engaging in. And engaging in those communities allowed me to understand that every single community has like a piece of a puzzle that will allow us to at some point like all work together. And I strongly believe that. And I find that like there are certain experiences that my friends who immigrated here within the past couple of years have been able to like tell me experiences that I have had and give me words to things that I wouldn't have been able to describe if it wasn't for their experiences of leaving home and how painful that was. And not realizing like, oh wow, like I didn't realize how much unaddressed trauma I had from having forcibly like having to leave my own lands to be in Algonquin territory because I'm from the plains, but also acknowledging like the plains is super racist and super homophobic and super transphobic. So existing there as like a two-spirit and queer person is like quite difficult if you don't have the roots there in the same ways that someone who moved and then tried to go back do. So I think like when I have these conversations of like how do we create safer spaces and community, I always tell people like I think a lot of that people think outwardly, but I think it actually we need to think inwardly. Like what are the things that we're doing that can cause harm to others? Like for a long time, like I didn't believe in pronouns, even though I'm a trans person. But then when I started to understand the importance of like if I can make a person feel comfortable and present in a space, and all I have to do is readjust my language, it's not even about me at that point. It's to make sure that person feels comfortable. And that's what I want. So I think too, like it's a lot of negotiation and recognizing like what is mine? Why am I feeling a certain type of way about this thing? And why don't I want to create space for this person? A lot of the times, like I've learned through this process of unpacking is like it's an internalized thing. And I think it's quite a struggle to unpack those things. Like I think one of the most recent ones that I continue, or at least the things that I've internalized, one of the most things that I've recently had to unpack was like ableism and how the world sees people who have disabilities and how the ways in which I have like internalized like ableism in a way where like I feel I wasn't, even though disability impacts my life, I wasn't able to make space for that and to allow myself to exist in spaces in a good way because I was unwilling as like a native person to acknowledge like, yeah, it's okay to have disability. And also like when we think about ceremonies, like how many ceremonies are actually accessible to people who have mobility issues. So like you have to be an able-bodied person to access these spaces, and I don't think that's fair. But I think about these things too as like a trans person who doesn't have access to a lot of spaces without discomfort. And I know a lot of people are on the front lines and really shifting how like Indigenous like youth can experience ceremony, but also too like ceremony can be a place of trauma when you've experienced violence in those spaces unintentionally, and that can also have like systemic impacts. I always think about like why are spaces of healing only for particular able-bodied like cisgendered people, and and a lot of that makes me think about like how do we quote unquote like restore the circle, how do we allow every single person to be able to be included within that. And I think it's a really difficult, it's really difficult, it's not easy, it is really hard to create spaces that are like safe. I don't even believe necessarily in safe spaces. I believe in creating safer spaces because I also think safety is a privilege. I don't think I'll ever have safety in any space that I go into, and a lot of that just has to go back to like acknowledging like my own identities and lived experiences, and how some people will always be like uncomfortable with something. But how can I create a space where I'm able to meet people where they're at? So I do lots of work with folks who, well, in sexual and reproductive health. And I feel like also like becoming a sex educator is really what allowed me to understand the importance of how to have difficult conversations and how to talk about uncomfortable things in spaces. And I find like when I first started like at Planned Parenthood Ottawa, I didn't even know how to say half of the words that I can say today, mostly because I felt my voice drop. But again, it always went back to like, why am I feeling shame when I'm saying the word penis or vagina? It really just goes back to shame. And then when I think about it and trace it back into a historical context, I understand why that's there. And I find like for me personally, like understanding the history allows me to be comfortable with being able to address these things. And when I am able to address those things and I have answers to it, it makes sense in a way where I can create space for that. But again, like when I talk about things like I've been for a really long time, like with some of the old folks that I've worked with in a previous organization, which were like mostly Indigenous women. I really wanted to talk about like anti-Blackness and how we shouldn't, like, I guess, incorporate African American vernacular within our language because that's really harmful to folks who are Black, and to not use like Black people in GIFs and just like the really subtle things. But I found people were just not ready to have those conversations and just completely shut down. But the second BLM happened and everything really took off, now I find I can have these conversations really easily with a lot of folks who weren't ready like a year to 2 years ago. So I think like a lot of the times too, like creating community is meeting people where they're at and kind of probing and being able to learn about what it takes to one keep operate like essentially like seeing where people are at, knowing that you cannot force a person to learn about these things, but when they're in a place where they're ready and willing to, like I'm kind of like just at this place where I've had enough people like on Twitter and my DMs try to be like, I like a racist person being like, hey, like convince me not to be racist. But in my head, I'm like, no, you're obviously not comfortable with this conversation. Why would I waste both of our times trying to debate you on something that you're just unwilling to have conversations of because you were literally having trauma-based responses to not wanting to learn the information. So like another tool that I like to use in these conversations is like trauma-informed care, is like understanding that every single person has some kind of like trauma, and the ways in which they engage in these conversations, especially if they're challenging of your identity, can actually elicit trauma based responses. And I find like being in an NTO and anti-R educator has required me to see a lot of different sides of different people based on like how comfortable they were to have these conversations. But it was always like Indigenous teachings and the ways that we can be in a circle and have these like difficult conversations and actually ask people like, what are some things that you want to learn, instead of me just giving you an agenda and telling you these are the things that I'm going to teach you, because that's like inherently decolonial. Instead of like creating this power dynamic within these spaces, actually asking people like, what do you want to learn? And I find when I ask people like, what do you want to learn, it creates this space of being able to like have safety. And I'm very transparent with people, like, you cannot ask me stupid questions. I just don't believe in that. Like, I've definitely been asked really strange questions, but I would prefer you ask me whatever you're thinking, even if it's problematic, because I want you to leave here with the correct information. I don't want you to linger or think about these things, but that requires a lot of capacity to be able to meet people where they're at. And really, like, harm reduction is what taught me how to meet people where they're at. And like growing up with people who struggle with addictions and being able to meet those people where they're at, even when they're struggling, has been probably like one of the hardest things that I've ever done, but it allowed me that I can apply that same thing within education when I'm trying to build healthier spaces. And I find like when I just am completely relaxed about my expectations about the world around me, and I'm able to have, I guess, like more like conversations of like, hey, like how are you doing? Where are you at? And knowing that people aren't going to be at the same levels, I find I'm just happier with results. Like, I don't over politicize things or feel like a type of way when someone says the wrong thing. It's more of like, actually, no, like, I understand that this language is inaccessible. That's okay to me. Like, I'm pretty sure like my grandparents were also like fighting against racism in their own ways, but they didn't necessarily have the language that I have today. How do I honor that these different things can exist in the same spaces? So I think like, one, like, we need to also at some point, like as Indigenous people too, like create spaces to teach settlers how to have those conversations, because I don't believe that we should have to continuously regurgitate our trauma to be valid in those spaces, when we can actually give them the teaching skills that they need to talk to Mima about whatever they need to talk about, to buckle up Mima. Because like, at the end of the day, one of the things I've realized in creating safer spaces is sometimes people who are racist don't actually see you as their equal. But the second someone who is their equal has that same conversation, it's just so quick to learn. But yeah, I think a lot about power and privilege, a lot of the reasons because of like gender and how that manifests within my life. But I think like these are all important conversations when we talk about safety. And really it was like my experiences of being like a trans person and how like I've had to like shift the ways that I engage in the system, but also shift the ways I engage in different communities based on like the things that I've experienced. Um, I really just want to share with other people all of these things that I've learned from a lot of different communities and how like everyone deserves a space like at the circle. Um, so I think I'm going to leave it at that for now. And then we're going to pan back to Gabby because Gabby's like, I have some things to share, but that was my piece of things to share. And I feel like after that, we can probably move into more of like a discussion.
Yeah, thanks, RJ. That's yeah, so much to consider and remember and take into consideration. I wanted to share a document that we worked on recently, A7G. And so this document, it came from like lots of conversations amongst many different people for probably like many years. So like conversations I've had with RJ, with Danny, with Josh, with like just my peers, you know. And I don't consider myself a youth anymore, because I'm kind of like in this I don't know, I'm in this like new transition in my life. But what I remember being a young person is that we would have a lot of conversations about concerns that we had, regarding different services, concerns that we had because we didn't have enough places where we could go and feel comfortable. And so, you know, we finally made a report about it. And we had to make a report because we would just we would bring it up to these organizations and service providers, and we would often like get like rejected, kind of like how RJ was describing their experience, um you know, being asked not to come to a space anymore, or things like that. And so our response was to make our own space. And I think that some people are kind of scared of this idea, and so that's kind of like that conversation about like external versus internal creating change. But that's what we had to do, and so that's why we created A7G. And we finally made this report probably like, I don't know, 10 years later, to have it in writing, to prove that, you know, we have been experiencing these things, and a lot of we need spaces and services to be better, because right now they're not doing what they say they're supposed to be doing. And so we created this mapping Indigenous services. And so I have lots of things open on my computer, so just ignore that. Oh yeah, I don't even have it up here. Give me a sec. But yeah, we had to create kind of like this. We had to create this report, so that we could see something better. And so within the report, a lot of young people told us their concerns, but they also told us their solutions. And so that's the really important thing too, is like you might be hearing like about what makes what makes a space unsafe, but within that conversation are actually solutions as well. And so, you know, if a space is harmful, then what can make it safe, and vice versa. So you can be learning two things at the same time, and that's what a lot of young people shared with us, when we did the reporting for this. So characteristics of a safe service provider, according to Indigenous youth here in Ottawa, you know, led by community, Community has to be involved in the space. Sometimes what we witness is non-Indigenous organizations that just specifically want to target Indigenous youth, but that actually leaves out a whole community of safe people, of parents, of uh, peers, of elders, knowledge keepers, and it actually takes away the community component of an Indigenous community. And we know for a fact that community is so important, and it's not just about peer to peer, but it's about, you know, knowing who your aunties are, knowing who maybe your adopted aunties are, knowing where those people are that are going to advocate for you, knowing where the knowledge keepers are, knowing where the elders are. um, and so those are kind of things that young people told us. They also told us like that they want people to acknowledge them when they come into a space. And for whatever reason, I don't know what it is. I some people have kind of said it's a cultural thing. And maybe it's a cultural thing that we've adopted along the way that isn't necessarily good. But what happens is sometimes when we go into a space, people don't acknowledge us. And so young people have actually told us that this makes them feel really uncomfortable. And I've had that experience. You know, one time I showed up to an Indigenous service provider, and no one acknowledged me for at least like half an hour. And this, to be honest, I've never been back to that service provider because of how unwelcomed I felt. And Indigenous youth right now, I really feel like they want to be welcomed. We all want to be welcomed, I think, you know. And so, just as Indigenous people too, like let's adjust that a little bit. Like let's get into the habit of like welcoming people, you know. And you know, I know that my cookum was always very welcoming in our community. And so thinking about my cookum is like, you know, she took care of like over 100 kids. She made milk and eggs, and shared, my family shared their the moose that they hunted with the whole community. And so we're very welcoming people. But why is it for some reason when we get into a service provider position that kind of ends? They also told us that peer-to-peer support is really important, and spaces being able to support peer-to-peer support. So I think of like a classroom, for example. A lot of the times in classrooms, like the teacher feels like they have to be the one that knows everything, and that everybody goes to them. And, you know, it creates like this pyramid. But those students in the classroom, they have to be able to be okay to work with each other, and communicate with each other, and not always having to rely on the teacher. You know, so they also told us about culturally safe places. Like, is your place, can you smudge in your facility? Or when someone says that they want to smudge, is it like this big ordeal? Like, is it like, okay, well, you could smudge, but I have to like let the janitor know, and they're gonna turn the fire alarm off from like 3 p.m. to 5 p.m. It's like, what? That's not that's not that's not it. We need to be able to just smudge when we need a smudge, because you know that smudge is so powerful. That smudge is so helpful in times of crisis. And I can't schedule when there's going to be a crisis. Like, I can't schedule that someone will need a smudge from 3 p.m. to 5 p.m. So to me, those spaces are not culturally safe. And that's just one example. Another example is like, is your space like welcoming of country food? Like, would your space be willing to have Inuit cutting up their country food on the floor? You know, is that okay with you? And if it's not okay with you, then that means that your space is not culturally safe, or accessible. So those are kind of the examples that young people told us, that I believe in as well. And we can't forget food is so important. Like, you literally can't have indigenous gatherings without food. Like, it's just like not a thing. It's not good. There has to be food, and there has to be um like, the types of food is kind of like, that can be debatable, but there just has to be enough food to have a full belly and to feel good. um Youth also, like RJ was talking about, meet youth where they're at. You cannot judge youth if you want that space to be safe. You can't be prescribing how young people should be living their lives or what they should and shouldn't do. That is not up to you at all. You can help young people with informed decisions. That's really great, helping folks make informed decisions, but never deciding on behalf of anyone how they should live their life. Um, yeah, and don't have expectations. Just like, it is what it is. Let things flow how they need to flow. I think having that adaptability is really important for safe spaces. Um, yeah, and space for self autonomy. um yeah, so in this particular instance, young people were telling us how they feel really uncomfortable when they go to a space and someone's like collecting data about them. And for a lot of indigenous folks, there's been a lot of data collected about us, like tons of data. Like, we're probably one of the most researched groups of people in Canada. And so we don't want to be researched anymore. If we go to a space, we should just be able to be in that space. We should just be able to eat some good food and laugh, and not have to worry about if someone's meeting their funding target uh, expectations. And so these all are really important parts of safe spaces. The other part about safe spaces is like, who is in the space. And we all have the ability, each and every one of us, to make a space safe or unsafe. um like, we can never fully make a space entirely safe, for reasons that RJ was talking about. But we really, like, I have the power to make sure that someone feels comfortable, and so things that young people told us that makes a person safer is indigenous led. So seeing our peers automatically kind of creates this safety. Seeing people that look like us automatically creates this safety. And not saying that just because someone looks like us or acts like us that they're safe, but it just kind of, we know that that person is probably not going to ask us to educate them about the last 150 years of colonization. Like, we know that that person's probably not going to judge us for eating a certain way, or for our maybe different cultural mannerisms. So that's kind of creates that automatic safeness. But having folks that are trauma informed, so important. Like RJ mentioned, being trauma informed can change everything. Trauma informed is about meeting people where they're at, not judging people, consent, validating lived experiences, and also having healthy boundaries, using accessible language. So I could tell you right now that some of the youth that come to A7G stuff would probably not even understand what the heck I'm talking about right now, and I was one of those young people. I know that I had such a hard time understanding academic language. I still do, to be quite honest. But I grew up in environments where nobody used this kind of language. No one used the word trauma informed. No one even used the word discriminatory. Like, and so we have to acknowledge that, and just because someone might not be able to understand the academic language, it doesn't mean that they're any less intelligent than someone who uses academic languages. It just means that they haven't been raised in that way or had that privilege to learn that type of language. And, that means meeting people where they're at, you know. And so the really important thing, and I think it's like such a broad um it covers a lot. It's like this youth friendly, this they young people said that they want to meet youth workers and youth coordinators and organizers that are youth friendly. And so for the youth, what they told us that meant someone who's open, trustworthy, inclusive, kind, respectful, um, and just really treating young people how you wanted to be treated, how you hope to be treated, and I think it's just kind of it's like a bare minimum. Just be kind. Really try your best not to talk down to people. I think that some people end up talking down to people and they don't even realizing it. So if someone calls you out for it, just take it how it is and try to address it, and move forward. But those are some of the things that young people told us. And these are like the bare minimum requirements of a safer space. And I also wanted to kind of go back to, what was brought up in the beginning around, most of all of our stuff is on our website. So just www.a7g.ca. But hopefully some of my colleagues could share some of the links in the chat. But we also, I wanted to also make sure that we don't forget to talk about accountability, because it's hard to create safer spaces. It's not easy. It doesn't just happen with the best of intentions. It doesn't just happen because you have good intentions and you want it to happen. There's accountability that has to take place. And like RJ was talking about, that means, there may be some confrontation, and there may be some hard conversations. But if you want to create safer spaces, you have to have those hard conversations sometimes. And so some examples of how we've kept accountability is, these are like really, really like extreme cases, I would say. But they're cases that I think happen so often. And to this day, I've never actually seen organizations be accountable. So they may have like guidelines or even code of ethics, and they might even have like a staff or a board member that breaches those code of ethics and nothing's actually done. And because people do not believe that code of ethics are legally binding, they just kind of disregard it. But for us, it's really, really important. Like our code of ethics is our bare minimum standard of how we operate. And so that's our group norms. Like our group norms are literally our code of ethics. And so we've had instances where a young man would come by, and it often starts off small and then it escalates. And so we often are really, we really are upfront when something is not feeling right. So for example, there was a young man, and he decided that he was going to hang out with some of the young femmes in the group after hours. And so like we can't really control those things as a youth organization. We can't really control like where folks go and where they hang out, at 2 a.m. in the morning. That's their prerogative and that's their life. But we felt that it was really inappropriate that he was an older man. He was in university and he was hanging out with high school students. So for us, we messaged him and we said, this is really inappropriate. You're hanging out with underage children. And he said, oh, I didn't even think about it like that. Like, I'm really sorry. It's not going to happen again. My bad, kind of thing. And so we're like, okay, cool. Like, we can get over that. And that's like, that's kind of like step one. But there's been a warning. And so it's always important to also have warnings. Like, again, speak up, when something's not right or something feels uncomfortable, like, speak up. It's really important to do that. But then once there's been a warning and someone continues to do bad behavior, this person continued to sexually harass in private. Some of the young folks in the group would kind of like stalk people on their campus, and just do like really, really horrible things. And because, young people trust us and they told us their experiences, we had to do something. And so we told this person that they're not welcome at group anymore. And we said, it's never it's never a locked door policy. We will ask people to leave, but we still believe in restorative justice. And so we still believe that if that person really, really worked on those issues and really made amends with the people that they harmed, and really put in effort and showed remorse, that maybe at some point that person would be welcome back. So it's never like a locked door policy, but our first priority is always going to be young Indigenous women and trans folks and Two-Spirit folks, because we also acknowledge that Indigenous men have had a lot of privilege and have gotten away with a lot of harm for far too long. So that's always our first priority. And we, unfortunately, that person didn't want to work on making amends with anyone or work on themselves. So we haven't seen that person. And that's what also happens is, when we do create these safe spaces and there's accountability, what we often see is those people kind of move on to the next group and to the next group. And so I think really creating networks amongst each other and being open with each other and connecting our spaces, even if it's not the same space, as long as there's kind of like those ongoing conversations about, this person has done this harm. And people call it like whisper networks and things like that. But whisper networks keep us safe, and they have for generations. So that's kind of what I wanted to share about accountability. And so where I come from in Alberta, we actually practice banishment. And so, not to say that we should bring that back or things like that, but there's a reason why Indigenous communities have practiced banishment out of safety, and it was like a last resort. It was because we don't have the same safety mechanisms that white people have. We can't rely on the police or other mechanisms to keep us safe. We literally have to keep our own communities safe. So yeah, that's what I wanted to share about that. So yeah, RJ, did you have anything else that you wanted to add to that?
Yeah, definitely. I was just witnessing a cat fight that was happening in my backyard. It actually wasn't my cat involved, but it was super loud. So, yeah, I think too, like when we think about like accountability, a lot of the things that I find when trying to like engage in these conversations is like I find like even how to apologize to like other people isn't something that is taught widely, and also even within our own communities. And while like definitely we can talk about like there are like a lot of like Indigenous communities who do practice banishment. I also think too, like with colonization and the extraction of Indigenous languages, and also the ways in which a lot of Indigenous folks experienced like different forms of like violence, particularly like sexual violence within like residential schools and throughout the 60s scoop. I think these things are inherently involved with how people have been able to like not necessarily have the same access to language around like how to apologize to another person, how to say I'm sorry, how to like be willing to like be okay with like sometimes like abuse does happen within our communities, and how do we navigate that beyond just like cutting people out, but also how to have those conversations. And I think too, like I've been involved in a lot of different organizations, like going through process of accountability, like also been a person having to go through a process of being accountable to others. I think it's really hard to like be vulnerable, to talk about like times where you've been wrong. And I think too, like shame is such a huge thing within so many like Indigenous spaces. So how do we talk about that? How do we talk about apologizing? How do we say sorry when things have happened within community spaces? And all of these things are really, really tough conversations within all communities. But one of the things I've realized is like apologizing to another person requires vulnerability. It requires being willing to admit that, like, yeah, I'm wrong. I shouldn't have done that. And I think a lot of the times, like, we don't learn the skills. Generally, in a Western context, we don't actually learn how to navigate when someone says no. And I think like this especially like manifests within masculinity in a very different way than it does for women, but I think it still does manifest for both. And what does it mean to be told you're wrong? And also too, like being in a position where I'm doing more like parenting, like how do you give a child autonomy? And when they say no, like most of the times in our culture, we're just like, oh, like it's almost like we treat children like pets in ways where they're like, I don't like, I know you said no, but I'm still going to like violate that boundary, even though you just said no, I don't want to be touched. So I think too, like a lot of this like goes back to like even the ways in which we like navigate parenting. Like how many times have we been in situations where we have told adults as children no, and the adults have just kind of violated that. So of course, like there's no weight to saying yes or no. We kind of just wait till we're older and are able to like inherit that power and to like use that against other people. But I think it goes so much more like beyond that. I think one of the best and most useful tools I've ever read was from my friend Lucayo, who also was able to get this resource from someone else that we know. I'm gonna leave the link here, but it's called Claim. I feel like it's really about like calling in and calling out. But I think generally these are just skills on how to like apologize to like another human being, and how to deal with like being called out, and like what does that look like. And I think too, like a lot of the times, like even within this like resource that I definitely like read a lot, it is really hard to like admit you're wrong, especially if you're feeling hurt about something. But I think too, like in order to create spaces of like healthy communication or things like this, like it requires us to be able to do that. And it's not easy. It's 100% not easy. All of these things like are things that I feel have been inherently extracted from our communities. I think when all of us were forced to learn English, a lot of the ways in which we did accountability processes like were taken from us. I've actually done a bit of research and into like what different accountability processes look like in different nations throughout so-called Canada. And one of the most interesting ones that I read about was in BC. I can't remember the nation on the top of my head, only because it's like the end of the day and I'm a bit tired. But in this particular nation, they had a ceremony where they would essentially, like, if you were caught cheating or like caught like not doing a good thing to like your partner, you were required to wear this mask with like a genital on your head in the middle of your community so everyone would know what you did, and how it was not okay. And I think like it's interesting when we talk about like infidelity, and even like different types of relationships, because I think all like the ways in which people generally engage within relationships are always going to look different. But I think when we're talking about like accountability, like a lot of the times the ways in which we all learn how to apologize isn't actually, unfortunately, from our immediate family. It's through romantic relationships. Romantic relationships are really what teach people like how to have those difficult conversations. But I think we should challenge that narrative and be able to have these tough conversations even amongst friendships. And I think for myself, at least, like it was friendships that really taught me like what love meant and how I had such a very warped understanding of what that meant, because like my association with love was actually like abuse, and I didn't realize that until later on in my life. So I think too, like not prioritizing certain relationships over each other and being able to give the same kind of value to your friendships, that of course like you're not going to do the same things in a romantic relationship, in a friendship, but still valuing those relationships. And I think we'll start to naturally see the shift of how we have these conversations, because a lot of the times like if people are done with being someone's friend, they have no problem like letting go of that person and kind of like moving on. um However, like if anyone's ever dealt with a friend breakup, I can tell you it's so much harder than an actual breakup. It is significantly harder, and I think like people need to really reflect on like why that is. Like why is it breaking up with a friend is so much harder? And I think again like it just goes back to the ways in which we communicate with other people, and how we need to like shift like outside of this understanding that the nuclear family dynamic is the only thing that's correct, because history tells us that's actually not true. And we can see a lot of our communities existed outside of that. When it says it takes a community to raise a child, they literally mean that. It wasn't just two parents that would do that, it was multiple people that would do that and have the say in terms of how that child would be raised. And that was really typical within a lot of our communities. And I think like when I think of that, it makes sense to me when we're trying to talk about like how do we talk about accountability, because if people are inherently and more involved in the very beginning, then these conversations are easy, instead of it being like, oh, like we need to have this really tough conversation and it's going to be like one of the first ones, and like we're also risking this person being able to just get up and leave. But I think too like committing to a community takes a different type of commitment that is internal for us to be able to commit to that space. And it's as equal to a relationship because it's giving you something that is significantly huge in terms of like meaning to your life and like how you do things. But it's a really tough process. Like it's not easy. Like telling people that you fucked up is not easy. Like, and also like not slipping into like the gaslighting. Like I'm definitely a person who is constantly like guilty of not communicating in a healthy way, but also always reflecting and being like, what are the ways that I can do better? And I've learned like really like when I'm the times where I'm like actually like going to therapy on a regular basis and in balance with a lot of the other things in my life, I find I'm more in check. Or if I'm more like researching on healthy communication and regularly reading those things, and healthy like in asterisks, because I don't actually want to police what healthy is to someone, but like in ways that like how do I do the least amount of harm? Also as like a person who's like transitioned and is more masculine, that now plays an impact in my relationships. So like how do I do that moving forward? But again, like I kind of want to open up and have more discussions on the floor, because I think this is really important, and we're really reaching into some really great topics, but also kind of like want to shine the light back on other folks, and see where they're at.
Yeah, for sure. So what I'd like to do is kind of like open it up for folks that are okay to be recorded first. And then if there's no one that wants to be recorded, that's cool too. We can just turn the recording off. But if there's anyone that has like something they want to share, what we usually do is we go around and do something we learned or we're going to take away from this talk. So we can kind of do it like that. I think that's a good way to close. But yeah, so anyone that wants to start is okay with being recorded. All right, I'm gonna turn the recording off. So let me just do that.